Men all too often forget that God is the greatest experience in human existence. Other experiences are limited in nature and content, but the experience of God has no limits, save those of the creature's comprehension capacity, and this very experience is in itself capacity enlarging. When men search for God, they are searching for everything. When they find God, they have found everything. The search for God is the unstinted bestowal of love, attended by amazing discoveries of new and greater love to be bestowed. All true love is from God, and man receives the divine affection as he himself bestows this love upon his fellows. Love is dynamic. It can never be captured. It is alive, free, thrilling, and always moving. Man can never take the love of the Father and imprison it within his heart. The Father's love can become real to mortal man only by passing through that man's personality, as he in turn bestows this love upon his fellows. The great circuit of love is from the Father, through sons, to brothers, and hence to the Supreme. The love of the Father appears in the mortal personality by the ministry of the indwelling adjuster. Such a God-knowing Son reveals this love to his universe brethren, and this fraternal affection is the essence of the love of the Supreme. Not paternal, but fraternal. That's page 1289. They're discussing God the Supreme in relation to human beings.
If one only thought of survival of the soul, that would be selfishness in itself. I mean, if that were the mere end.
That, I think, is what Jesus meant when he said, he who would save his life will lose it. But he who's willing to lose his life will save it. If your only reason for being good is to just make sure that you survive, I kind of wonder about that motive.
Well, that's sheer selfishness.
Yeah. That would be an egocentric motive, would it not?
Talk about Rodin a little, how that wonderful philosopher could have lived so far ahead of his time.
He didn't.
He didn't?
He didn't. What we've got there is the distillate of Greek philosophy. And he probably wasn't quite that wonderful. He talked for a week. The Midwares edited his talk and condensed it in one paper. They took the cream of Greek philosophy and immortalized it in this book.
It was one of the few they did take.
Sure.
That made me think it was probably superior.
It's one of my favorite papers. It's the paper which discusses the human art of living in contrast to the mere animal urge to live. When men dare to forsake a life of natural craving for one of adventurous art and uncertain logic, you weighed anchor, see? They must expect to suffer the consequent hazards of emotional casualties, conflicts, unhappiness, and uncertainties, at least until the time of their attainment of some degree of intellectual and emotional maturity. You know, I think of the development of a religious life as being a little bit analogous to the development of a human being. Stop and think of a youngster, make him a boy, 10 or 11 years old, prepubescent. He's a pretty well unified kid, isn't he? He's pretty well coordinated, and he's a grown-up boy. Then puberty hits him, And he begins falling over his feet and squeaking around and falling down. And that's what Rodin's talking about here. As long as you're pretty content to be a mammal, you've got no problems. You'll be pretty well adjusted. You're content. But if the hormone of religion hits you, then at least during the period of adolescence, it'll be a little stormy until you mature from a religious standpoint. Let's talk a little more about what Rodin said about prayer. The greatest of all methods of problem solving I've learned from Jesus, your master. I refer to that which he so constantly practices and which he has so faithfully taught you, the isolation of worshipful meditation. In this habit of Jesus going off so frequently by himself to commune with the Father in heaven is to be found the technique not only of gathering strength and wisdom for the ordinary conflicts of living, but also of appropriating the energy for the solution of the higher problems of a moral and spiritual nature. But even correct methods at solving problems will not compensate for inherent defects of personality or atone for the absence of the hunger and thirst for true righteousness. I'm deeply impressed with the custom of Jesus in going apart by himself to engage in these seasons of solitary survey of the problems of living, to seek for new stores of wisdom and energy, for meeting the manifold demands of social service, to quicken and deepen the supreme purpose of living by actually subjecting the total personality to the consciousness of contacting with divinity, to grasp for possession of new and better methods of adjusting oneself to the ever-changing situations of living existence, to effect those vital reconstructions and readjustments of one's personal attitudes, which are so essential to enhanced insight into everything worthwhile and real, and to do all this with an eye single to the glory of God, to breathe in sincerity your Master's favorite prayer, not my will, but yours be done. This worshipful practice of your Master brings that relaxation which renews the mind, that illumination which inspires the soul, that courage which enables one bravely to face one's problems, that self-understanding which obliterates debilitating fear, and that consciousness of union with divinity which equips man with the assurance that enables him to dare to be godlike. The relaxation of worship or spiritual communion as practiced by the Master relieves tension, removes conflicts, and mightily augments the total resources of the personality. And all this philosophy, plus the gospel of the kingdom, constitutes the new religion, as I understand it. Rodin talks about the transfer of goals from, you might say, easy ones to tough ones, or from animal goals to truly human goals, because truly human goals embrace God, whereas subhuman goals embrace merely material gadgets, you know. And he points out that to do this, you've got to have a pretty king-size gas tank. The effort toward maturity necessitates work, and work requires energy. Whence the power to accomplish all this? The physical things can be taken for granted. But the Master has well said, man cannot live by bread alone. Granted the possession of a normal body and reasonably good health, we must next look for those lures which will act as a stimulus to call forth man's slumbering spiritual forces. Jesus has taught us that God lives in man. Then how can we induce man to release these soul-bound powers of divinity and infinity? How shall we induce men to let go of God, that he may spring forth to the refreshment of our own souls, while in transit outward, and then to serve the purpose of enlightening, uplifting, and blessing countless other souls? How best can I awaken those latent powers for good which lie dormant in your souls? One thing I'm sure of: emotional excitement is not the ideal spiritual stimulus. Excitement does not augment energy. It rather exhausts the powers of both mind and body. Whence comes the energy to do these great things? Look to your Master. Even now he was out in the hills taking in power, while we are here giving out energy. The secret of all this problem is wrapped up in spiritual communion, in worship. From the human standpoint, it is a question of combined meditation and relaxation. Meditation makes the contact of mind with spirit. Relaxation determines the capacity for spiritual receptivity. And this interchange of strength for weakness, courage for fear, the will of God for the mind of self, constitutes worship. At least that is the way the philosopher views it. When these experiences are frequently repeated, they crystallize into habits, strength-giving and worshipful habits. And such habits eventually formulate themselves into a spiritual character. And such a character is finally recognized by one's fellows as a mature personality. These practices are difficult and time-consuming at first, but when they become habitual, they are at once restful and time-saving. The more complex society becomes, and the more the lures of civilization multiply, the more urgent will become the necessity for God-knowing individuals to form such protective, habitual practices designed to conserve and to augment their spiritual energies. I love this one too. This is one, Pat, incidentally, which BM, I think, wishes weren't in the book. It requires intelligence to it doesn't say prayer here now. It requires intelligence to secure one's share of the desirable things of life. It is wholly erroneous to suppose that faithfulness in doing one's daily work will ensure the rewards of wealth. Barring the occasional and accidental acquirement of wealth, the material rewards of the temporal life are found to flow in certain well-organized channels, and only those who have access to these channels may expect to be well rewarded for their temporal efforts. Poverty must ever be the lot of all men who seek for wealth in isolated and individual channels. Wise planning, therefore, becomes the one thing essential to worldly prosperity. Success requires not only devotion to one's work, but also that one should function as a part of some one of the channels of material wealth. If you are unwise, you can bestow a devoted life upon your generation without material reward. If you are an accidental beneficiary of the flow of wealth, you may roll in luxury, even though you have done nothing worthwhile for your fellow men. So much for the Egyptian concept of providence. Life will become a burden of existence unless you learn how to fail gracefully. There is an art in defeat, which noble souls always acquire. You must know how to lose cheerfully. You must be fearless of disappointment. Never hesitate to admit failure. Make no attempt to hide failure under deceptive smiles and beaming optimism. It sounds well always to claim success, but the end results are appalling. I see in the religion of Jesus In the teachings of Jesus, religion at its best. This gospel enables us to seek for the true God and to find Him. But are we willing to pay the price of this entrance into the kingdom of heaven? Are we willing to be born again, to be remade? Are we willing to be subject to this terrible and testing process of self-destruction and soul reconstruction? Has not the Master said, whoso would save his life must lose it? Think not that I have come to bring peace, but rather a soul struggle. True, after we pay the price of dedication to the Father's will, we do experience great peace, provided we continue to walk in these spiritual paths of consecrated living. Now, are we truly forsaking the lures of the known order of existence, while we unreservedly dedicate our quest to the lures of the unknown and unexplored order of the existence of a future life of adventure in the spirit worlds of the higher idealism of divine reality? The religion of Jesus demands living and spiritual experience. Other religions may consist in traditional beliefs, emotional feelings, philosophic consciousness, and all of that. But the teaching of the Master requires the attainment of actual levels of real spirit progression. That was quite a guy, wasn't he? One last question and we'll quit. Could Jesus have saved himself from the cross and gone on to die a natural death to still attain the sum total of human experience? Not without violating the decisions which he made during the 40 days in the wilderness after the baptism. Jesus made some decisions which in part added up to this: he would never use his creator powers to help himself. He might use them to help his fellow men, but he would never use them to help himself, and he never did. I think he could have humanly avoided the situation of the cross, but he elected not to. And having invoked that chain of circumstances, he accepted the consequences. He did not have to go to Jerusalem, enter Jerusalem on Palm Sunday and teach there that last week, nor tarry in Gethsemane. And having done these things, he accepted the course of human events. And I think he was doing this to prove something. I think he was trying to show all human beings that he understands what it is to get a tough break in life, a real tough. And it hurt too. When he prayed in Gethsemane, this was no phony prayer. This was the prayer of a human being who didn't like what lay ahead. And being crucified was the lousiest way they had of putting a human being to death. A Roman citizen could not be crucified. He could be beheaded, but not crucified. The human Jesus was a little aghast at what lay immediately ahead, and he just wanted to check, is this really now the deal? I've always been so glad he asked that question. He was just checking to be sure. No, he could not have saved himself. What? When he prayed in Gethsemane and said, Father, do I have to drink this cup? Pardon me for using ordinary language. Is this really the deal? No, he could not have saved himself from the cross in the situation he was in without violating his own basic decisions, which he'd made at the beginning of his public career. How big is paradise? Well, let's stop and do some real thinking now. Paradise has no distance, because distance is a function of space. Let me help you in your semantics a little bit. When you say that you weigh 145 pounds, what are you saying? Are you describing the mass of your body? Yes, in practical, loose language, you are. But actually what you're describing is the action of Urantia gravity on that mass. The term pound is a measure of gravity action. Because if you moved into a different gravity field, you would weigh more or less. What would you weigh on Jupiter? Go up in the thousands of pounds, you wouldn't be able to move. If you could get on the moon and live there, you wouldn't weigh 145 pounds. You'd weigh, 50 pounds? Something like that. All right. Distance is a function of space, as the term pound is a function of gravity. If you want a good mass term, which is independent of gravity, there is such a word. It's called a poundal. That's a unit of mass. But what we call pound is a function of gravity. Distance is a function of space. I don't think there are any distances on Paradise. What is on Paradise? The papers refer to Paradise area. And they point out that Paradise area is non-spatial. Hence, serviceable in many ways that we don't visualize. Our whole concept of size goes out the window when we think about Paradise. It's interesting to note that the concept of proportion stands up. They can give us Paradise proportions regardless of space. And they give us those proportions. If you take the east-west dimension of Paradise, having a value of 1, then the north-south dimension equals 1 1/6, or 7/6. And the up-down dimension equals 1/10.
Well, what's the one then?
1
Is the east and west?
is the east-west, yes. And the north-south equals 1 and 1/6.
That's right.
A little longer.
And the thickness.
And very flat.
Very flat.
Thickness
and-
is 1/10.
You get there a basic pattern, which determines the pattern of everything else. That Paradise ellipse is reflected in all the concentric space levels of the master universe. Everything is elliptical. I like this statement. Here again you get an idea of proportion. They say that where upper Paradise gives way to the periphery, it's a sharp edge as you go from it. But then they hedge and they say Paradise is so enormous that even though this is a sharp edge in proportion, it's imperceptible as you traverse it. Please note a good example of the humility displayed by the authors of these papers. This paper is being written by a perfecter of wisdom. He is a coordinate of the author of paper 1, who among other things says, I portray the reality and truth of the Father's nature and attributes with unchallengeable authority. I know whereof I speak. One of this divine counselor's colleague introduces the discussion of nether paradise with a statement. Concerning nether paradise, we know only that which is revealed. Personalities do not sojourn there. I have a little more respect for authority when it admits ignorance in certain areas. And the author of the paper is saying to us here, this is what we've been told. We've never been there. This is secondhand information. Apparently, what goes on in nether paradise, as Fred Squires put it, he said God lives on the first floor and he's got the furnace in the basement. And it's a good homely way of looking at it. This is the furnace room, the boiler room of the universe of universes. And about all that we know anything about is this outermost zone of activities. We don't know anything about the centermost zone of activities. It's called the unknown and unrevealed zone of infinity. How about that? And it's surrounded by an unnamed area. They aren't even going to bother naming it. They just tell us it's there. Now the third zone, we know a little something about. It's a triconcentric arrangement, this third zone. And the innermost subzone appears to be the location of the functions of paradise as a material governor. I think of paradise as a material heart pumping energy. The outermost subzone is the central focalization of the unqualified absolute. Yes.
Are you speaking of nether paradise?
Of nether paradise,
Can you
right.
repeat what you just said, John?
The outermost subzone is the central focalization of the unqualified absolute. The force pressure at the north end of the aisle is greater than elsewhere. And this gives us the basis for absolute direction. Since paradise is flat, you know which way is up and down. And given a greater out pressure at one end of the aisle, that can be defined as north. And all other directions now follow. We are used to thinking of space as a nothing. And it isn't. It is a something. It exists in relation to something which is not space, which these papers refer to as mid-space. Let me suggest some things to you which will help you get a feel for the space that they describe. When water freezes, why doesn't it contract as most things do when they freeze? Of course, if water contracted when it froze, the oceans would freeze from the bottom up, and it would have been impossible ever to have evolved life on this planet. Because if you ever got them frozen on the bottom, they'd never thaw out, would they? Sun's rays would never penetrate. Very handy that water expands when it freezes, isn't it? How does water expand? Well, let's consider the nature of matter. Matter exists in space, does it not? And space also exists in matter. This table is quite solid, isn't it? And yet, this table is made up of cells, which in turn are made up of molecular chains, and these molecules are made up of atoms. And these atoms contain a nucleus with orbital electrons, and the relative relationship of the electron to the nucleus is very much like the relationship of the planets in our solar system to the sun. And our solar system is mostly empty space, isn't it? Are you with me? An atom is mostly empty space. As a physicist would view this table, I remember reading this first in Eddington years ago, this table is mostly empty space. When you look at it that way, you can see why a spiritual being like a solitary messenger freely moves through matter. It's mostly empty space. We can then make a statement that space is a property of matter. Matter exists in space. Space exists in matter. When water freezes, it traps some more space, hence becomes less dense. There is less mass in a given volume. Are you with me? Density is merely an expression of the relationship between mass and volume. More mass in a given volume, dense like lead. Less mass in a given volume, less dense like feathers, you know. Water is a space trapper. And what it traps is real. It changes the physical property of the material, substance, right? Ice floats. Let's see if we can catch water monkeying around with space in any other direction. If you take some water, just to keep this thing chemically clean, let's take 100 cc of distilled water. Put it in a beaker, take off a reading, you've got so much volume of water. Take some table salt, sodium chloride. Measure the volume of the sodium chloride. Put the salt in solution in the water. When you take a reading on your graduated beaker, the volume of the solution is less than the volume of the water plus the volume of the salt. This is from Wordsville. But it happens. How can you explain it? I offer this solution. When water takes something into solution, it gives up some space so that you have a smaller volume than the sum of the two. This is a well-known physical fact. In other words, space is real. You know, if you twist things around, you get new meanings. One of the cutest statements I've ever read in my life was in Time magazine a couple of months ago in a discussion of genetics, in which it said, a hen is an egg's way of making another egg. Isn't that a dandy? All right. You've all been exposed to this statement, that gravity diminishes as the square of the distance traversed. Sound familiar? All right, let me run a switcheroo on you. Space is a positive reality in the universe, which so acts on gravity as to cause it to diminish as the square of the distance traversed. That's just as valid a statement. Space is real. These papers introduce the concept of space in relationship to mid-space. And they point out that space has a property of being something which is conducive to motion. I assume of physical things. Whereas mid-space is resistant to motion. If you had the means of transit let's be Buck Roger-ish and get us a spaceship. And we start up at right angles to the plane of the Milky Way, which is our Vantan. If we could travel long enough, we would begin to run out of space and begin to run into mid-space. How would we know this? Our ship would slow down. We are encountering a condition in reality which resists motion. Let's say we're applying 100 units of energy and achieving 100 units of velocity. And all of a sudden our velocity's been cut down to 10 with the same application of energy. So we step her up to 1,000 units of energy. We move up again to 100 units of velocity. We stick our snout a little deeper into mid-space, and I think our velocity would fall off again. And we step her up to 10,000 units of energy. And no matter how much energy we apply, I think as we would penetrate mid-space, we would eventually encounter equal resistance to motion. Until finally, even with the most Buck Roger-ish spaceship, we would run out of jets. We just wouldn't have any more energy to draw on. That's as far as we'd go into mid-space. I don't think you bounce on mid-space. I just think you encounter increasing resistance to motion. Time is something we deduce. They make the point that relationships to time do not exist without motion in space, but consciousness of time does. And there are 3 levels of time consciousness. As mind perceives it, as spirit perceives it, and as personality creates a unique time consciousness. The only truly non-temporal place is paradise area. Gosh, I can't visualize that. I think that paradise citizens have a concept of sequence, but it's non-temporal sequence. I think they have an understanding of source relationships, but they aren't necessarily temporal sequence source relationships. There's an interesting comment here as to why you have to go to sleep when you finally enter paradise. You go there before with only a student's visa. When you take out your citizenship papers, you've got to make formal entry through the mid-space zones. And that's where you leave time as a creature and enter eternity. In the 3rd paragraph on page 137, you have another interesting comment on space relationships. The unqualified absolute pervades all space. The deity absolute may be universally present, but hardly space present. Deity absolute's a spiritual reality. Might have a relationship to space, but is not in space. The discussion of the part and the whole sets up the first problem in conduct. Because deity has 2 basic attitudes, as we've been discovering. The Trinity is not concerned with people, just with totals. The Supreme Being is concerned with totals. Now the Father is not concerned with totals at all. He's concerned only with each individual, one at a time, simultaneously. Sonship is a reality of the part, but brotherhood is a reality of the whole, isn't it? And you get some very interesting, this is the beginning of a discussion that goes all the way through these papers as you encounter the paradoxes of the seeming conflicts between the part and the whole in time and space. The papers assure us that from God's viewpoint and the paradise perspective, there are no such conflicts. But out here in time and space, love and justice apparently conflict. I think one of the most touching discussions of this is found in part 2. Pick up some threads on page 616 and 617. They're discussing here, why didn't they crack down on Lucifer? Parents who have born and reared children are better able to understand why Michael, a creator father, might be slow to condemn and destroy his own sons. No affectionate father is ever precipitate in visiting punishment upon an erring member of his family. Patience cannot function independently of time. While wrongdoing is always deleterious to a family, wisdom and love admonish the upright children to bear with an erring brother during the time granted by the affectionate father, in which the sinner may see the error of his ways and embrace salvation. 6:18. If an affectionate father of a large family chooses to show mercy to one of his children guilty of grievous wrongdoing, it may well be that the extension of mercy to this misbehaving child will work a temporary hardship upon all the other and well-behaved children. Such eventualities are inevitable. Such a risk is inseparable from the reality situation of having a loving parent and of being a member of a family group. Each member of a family profits from the righteous conduct of every other member. Likewise must each member suffer the immediate time consequences of the misconduct of every other member. Families, groups, nations, races, worlds, systems, constellations, and universes are relationships of association which possess individuality, and therefore does every member of any such group, large or small, reap the benefits and suffer the consequences of the right doing and the wrongdoing of all other members of the group concerned. But one thing should be made clear. None of these fraternal consequences of misbehavior in the group can ever jeopardize your eternal prospects or in the least degree deprive you of your divine right of paradise ascension and God attainment. You suffer the time consequences, but you're not penalized in eternity. You know, that's awfully tight reasoning, isn't it? You want a loving father? You want to be a member of this family? Then you're going to be affected not only by the father's love for you, but you're going to accept the consequences of family membership, good or bad. You cannot escape wholeness relations any more than you can seek to, if you want to benefit by part relationships. And then next to the last paragraph on page 140, they introduce what appears to be one of the basic themes in the Urantia papers, where in essence they say, out here in the evolutionary creations, energy matter is dominant, except in personality, where spirit, through the mediation of mind, is striving for the mastery.